21st of June, 1866, the day Martha Elizabeth Whitmore first saw the endless prairie stretch before her, like an ocean of gold. She knew her life would never return to its former shape. The Conestoga wagon lurched forward with such violence that her bonnet flew backward, revealing auburn hair dampened by sweat and summer heat. Her father, Samuel Whitmore, gripped the reins with calloused hands, steering their oxen westward along the Oregon Trail, while her mother sat silent beside him, clutching a Bible that had survived 3 generations. The Civil War had ended just 14 months prior, leaving the nation wounded and searching for renewal. Thousands of families, like the Whitmores, fled the destruction of the South and the overcrowded cities of the East, chasing promises of free land under the Homestead Act of 1862. Martha was 19 years old, unmarried, and uncertain whether the Western Territories held opportunity or merely a different kind of hardship. The wagon train comprised 43 families, all strangers bound by shared desperation and hope. They had departed from Independence, Missouri 6 weeks earlier, guided by a seasoned trail master named Josiah Crawford, whose weathered face bore the markings of a man who had witnessed both the beauty and brutality of the frontier. Each evening, the wagons formed a protective circle, and families gathered around campfires, sharing stories, songs, and the persistent anxiety that accompanied every mile. It was during the 3rd week of their journey that Martha first noticed him, a young man who rode ahead of the train on a chestnut mare, scouting the terrain and returning each evening with reports of river crossings and potential campsites. His name was Daniel Joseph McCarran. The eldest son of Irish immigrants who had settled in Pennsylvania before the war, claimed his father's life at Gettysburg. Daniel had served briefly with the Union cavalry, though he rarely spoke of those days. At 24, he possessed the quiet confidence of someone who had learned survival through necessity rather than instruction. Their first conversation occurred purely by accident. Martha had wandered beyond the wagon circle at dusk, seeking privacy and a moment's respite from her mother's constant supervision. She walked toward a grove of cottonwood trees near a shallow creek, drawn by the sound of flowing water. There, watering his horse, stood Daniel McCarran. He looked up, startled, his hand instinctively moving toward the revolver at his hip before recognizing her as one of the travelers. "Evening, miss," he said, tipping his worn hat. "Shouldn't wander too far." "Crawford spotted Sioux scouts yesterday morning." Martha felt her heart quicken, though whether from fear or the intensity of his gaze she could not determine.
"I only wanted a moment alone,"
she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "The wagon feels like a coffin some days." Daniel smiled then, a brief transformation that softened the hard lines of his face. "I understand that feeling. Sometimes the open road is the only thing that makes sense." He paused, studying her with indirectness that would have been improper in any Eastern parlor. "You're Samuel Whitmore's daughter, heading to Oregon?" "We're claiming land in the Willamette Valley," Martha answered. "My father believes we can start fresh there, build something lasting." "Lasting," Daniel repeated, as if testing the words. "Wait. That's what everyone's chasing, I suppose. Something that won't burn down or get shot to pieces." According to an article published in the Missouri Republican newspaper in 1866, nearly 300,000 emigrants had traveled the Oregon Trail since its establishment, transforming it into the primary artery of Western expansion. The journey typically required 5 to 6 months, covered approximately 2,000 miles, and claimed the lives of roughly 1 in 10 travelers through disease, accidents, and occasional conflicts with Native American tribes defending their ancestral lands. As darkness descended over the prairie, Martha and Daniel walked back toward the wagon circle together, maintaining a respectful distance that propriety demanded. Yet something unspoken had passed between them, a recognition that they were both searching for more than just land or security. They were seeking a future that might justify the losses they had already endured. That night, lying beneath the canvas cover of her family's wagon, Martha listened to the chorus of crickets and distant coyotes. She thought of Daniel's words about the open road making sense, and wondered if she had finally found someone who understood the restlessness that had always lived inside her, the hunger for something beyond the narrow expectations of what a woman's life should be. 17th of July, 1866, brought the wagon train within sight of Fort Laramie, a military outpost nestled along the North Platte River in present-day Wyoming Territory. The fort represented civilization's fragile foothold in a vast wilderness, a place where emigrants could rest, repair equipment, and gather information about the journey ahead. Martha pressed her face against the canvas opening of the wagon, watching as the wooden palisade walls emerged through the summer haze. The relationship between Martha and Daniel had deepened during the intervening weeks, though always within the bounds of propriety. He began riding closer to the Whitmore wagon during the day, offering assistance with repairs and pointing out landmarks. In the evenings, after her chores were completed, Martha would sit with Daniel near the edge of the camp, where they talked about everything except the obvious attraction growing between them. Daniel spoke of his childhood in Pennsylvania, how his father had worked in the coal mines before emigrating west, seeking better opportunities for his sons. He described his mother's grief after learning of her husband's death at Gettysburg, how she had aged a decade in a single day. Martha, in turn, shared her memories of Virginia before the war. The plantation life that had seemed eternal until Sherman's march reduced it to ashes and memory. Her father had owned no slaves. Their farm was modest, but the destruction had been thorough and indiscriminate. "I sometimes wonder what we're really running from," Martha confessed one evening, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Or if we're running at all. Maybe we're just drifting." Daniel considered this carefully before responding. "I think we're choosing. That's different from drifting. Every morning we wake up and point the wagons west. That's a choice. Every river we cross, every mountain pass we navigate, those are choices." At Fort Laramie, the emigrants discovered troubling news. Captain William Fetterman and 80 men had been killed by Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors just 6 months earlier near Fort Phil Kearny, roughly 180 miles northwest. The incident had intensified tensions throughout the region, and military officials strongly advised wagon trains to travel in larger groups and maintain constant vigilance. Josiah Crawford, the trail master, called a meeting on their second evening at the fort. The emigrants gathered in a clearing near the stockade walls, their faces illuminated by lantern light and anxiety. Crawford was a man of few words, but his reputation commanded respect. "We've got a decision to make," he announced, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "The route through Fort Phil Kearny is faster, but it's dangerous right now. Red Cloud's warriors are defending their hunting grounds, and they've got every right to do so, even if Washington doesn't see it that way. We can take the southern route, add 3 weeks to our journey, or we can stay together and take our chances with the northern pass." The discussion that followed revealed the fractures within the group. Families with young children advocated for safety regardless of delay. Others, desperate to reach Oregon before winter, argued for accepting the risk. Samuel Whitmore stood and expressed his view. "We've come too far to turn back or take unnecessary chances. I say we go south, protect our families." Daniel, standing apart from the main group, caught Martha's eye across the firelight. Later, when the meeting had dissolved into smaller conversations, they found each other near the fort's eastern wall, where sentries paced above them in the gathering darkness. "Your father's right," Daniel said without preamble. "Safe route makes sense, but you don't believe in it," Martha replied. Knowing him well enough now to read the hesitation in his voice, "I believe in survival," Daniel answered. "And I believe that sometimes the longest route is the shortest distance to the grave. Winter in the mountains doesn't negotiate." He turned to face her fully, his expression serious in the moonlight. "There's something I need to tell you, Martha. Crawford asked me to scout ahead regardless of which route the train chooses. He needs information about water sources and potential campsites. I'll be gone for weeks, maybe more." The announcement struck Martha with unexpected force. In the space of a month, Daniel had become her anchor, the person who made the journey bearable and even meaningful. The thought of continuing without his presence felt suddenly impossible. "When do you leave?" she managed to ask. "Dawn, day after tomorrow." They stood in silence, both recognizing that something needed to be said, but neither knowing precisely how to say it. The rules of courtship they had known in the East seemed absurd out here, where death waited around every bend and future was measured in miles rather than years. "Martha," Daniel began, then stopped. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a gesture of nervousness she had never seen him make before. "I know we haven't known each other long. I know your father probably has expectations about who you might marry, someone more established, more prosperous. But when I'm out there alone, the thing that keeps me riding back is you. Knowing you're here, waiting, hoping I'll return. If that means something to you, if I mean something to you, I need to know before I leave." Martha felt tears forming, though she refused to let them fall. Her entire life had been constructed around other people's expectations, her parents' wishes, society's demands, the narrow definition of what a proper Southern woman should want. But standing there beneath the Wyoming stars, facing a man who saw her as something more than decorative or dutiful, she finally understood what Daniel had meant about choosing. "You mean everything?" she whispered. "Come back to me, Daniel. Whatever happens, find your way back." He smiled then, the same transforming smile she had seen that first evening by the creek. "That's a promise I can keep." 29th of July, 1866, marked Daniel's departure from the wagon train. Now traveling along the southern route toward South Pass, Martha watched him ride north into the breaking dawn, his figure gradually dissolving into the prairie haze until only the horizon remained. The emptiness he left behind was profound, a void that no amount of daily routine could adequately fill. The wagon train continued its methodical progress westward, averaging 12 to 15 miles per day across terrain that shifted from flat grasslands to rolling hills and eventually toward the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. Martha threw herself into the work of survival cooking over open fires, mending clothes, helping her mother preserve what food they could gather from the landscape. Yet every evening when the wagons circled and families settled into their temporary camps, she found herself scanning the eastern horizon for a rider who never appeared. Samuel Whitmore noticed his daughter's preoccupation. One evening, as they sat together repairing a wagon wheel damaged by rocky terrain, he broached the subject with characteristic directness. "That McCarran boy?" he said, not looking up from his work. "You've developed feelings for him." It was not a question. Martha considered denying it, maintaining the pretense that her relationship with Daniel had been merely friendly, but the lie felt too exhausting to sustain. "Yes, Papa," she answered simply. Samuel was quiet for a long moment, his hands working methodically on the wheel hub. "He's a good man as far as I can tell. War veteran, capable, respectful. But he's also got nothing, no land, no prospects beyond what he can scout or hunt. You understand that?" "I understand that he's alive," Martha replied, her voice sharper than she intended. "After everything we've survived, being alive and decent seems like more than enough." Her father's expression softened. He had lost 2 brothers in the war, watched his farm burn, and buried his youngest daughter to typhoid fever before they'd even reached Missouri. The harsh arithmetic of survival had changed his calculations about what mattered. "Your mother wants better for you," he said carefully. "She imagines you married to a merchant or a landowner, someone who can provide security. But I think you're right. Alive and decent might be the best we can hope for in this world." The conversation represented an unspoken permission, though Martha knew her mother would prove harder to convince. Eleanor Whitmore came from old Virginia society, where lineage and property defined a person's worth. The Western territories represented necessary exile to her, not opportunity. She clung to the social structures of her former life with desperate tenacity. As August arrived, the wagon train reached South Pass, the gentle crossing of the Continental Divide that marked the journey's psychological midpoint. Here, at 7,550 feet above sea level, water began flowing toward the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. It should have felt triumphant, but the accomplishment was overshadowed by growing concern about Daniel's prolonged absence. Josiah Crawford tried to reassure Martha. "Scouting takes time, Miss Whitmore. The territory is vast, and a good scout checks multiple routes, water sources, potential dangers. McCarran knows what he's doing. He'll return when he has useful information." But as days stretched into weeks, even Crawford's confidence began to waver. Other scouts had returned from their assignments, bringing reports of Shoshone tribes encountered peacefully. Good grazing land identified for future stops, and passable routes through the approaching mountain ranges. Only Daniel remained absent, his silence becoming increasingly ominous. Martha began writing letters she knew would never be mailed, pouring her thoughts and fears onto precious paper that would have been better used for other purposes. She wrote about the landscape they were crossing, the way afternoon thunderstorms swept across the plains with biblical fury, the gradual transformation she felt occurring within herself as they moved farther from everything familiar. "I am becoming someone I don't fully recognize," she wrote on the night of August 15th. "The woman I was in Virginia would have waited patiently, trusting that men would handle dangerous matters while she embroidered or practiced piano. But that woman is dying, Daniel, and someone harder is taking her place. Someone who understands that survival requires more than compliance. I think you would approve of this version of me. I think perhaps you've always seen her, even before I knew she existed." The letters accumulated in a small wooden box. Daniel had given her before his departure a simple container meant for storing sewing supplies, but which had become a repository for words that connected her to a man who might already be dead. According to military records examined decades later by frontier historians, the summer of 1866 represented one of the most volatile periods in the Indian Wars of the American West. Following the Fetterman Massacre in December 1860, Red Cloud's coalition had effectively closed the Bozeman Trail, resulting in numerous casualties and forcing the U.S. Army to reconsider its expansion strategies. Scouts operating independently during this period faced extraordinary danger. September arrived with cooler temperatures and the first hints of autumn color in the high-elevation vegetation. The wagon train had reached Fort Bridger in southwestern Wyoming Territory, another military outpost offering rest and resupply. Martha helped her mother trade preserved vegetables for fabric and ammunition, maintaining the appearance of normalcy while her internal world contracted around a single question: was Daniel alive? On the evening of September 7th, as sunset painted the mountains in shades of copper and gold, a rider approached from the northeast. The sentry's call brought people from their wagons, and Martha's heart seized in her chest as she recognized the chestnut mare. But the rider was not Daniel. The man who dismounted was younger, perhaps 19, with a bloody bandage wrapped around his left arm. He identified himself as Thomas McCarran, Daniel's younger brother. "There was trouble," Thomas said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and pain. "Lakota warriors caught us near Powder River. Daniel was hit. I don't know how bad. We separated so I could get back with the information Crawford needed. Daniel stayed behind to draw them off." The camp fell silent. Martha felt her legs weaken but refused to fall. "When?" she managed to ask. "When did this happen?" "3 weeks ago," Thomas answered, his eyes unable to meet hers. "I'm sorry. I rode as fast as I could, but I don't know if he made it out. I don't know if my brother's alive." 8th of September, 1866, dawned cold and clear, the morning air carrying the sharp bite of early autumn at high elevation. Martha had not slept. She sat at the back of her family's wagon, wrapped in a wool blanket, watching the sky transition from black to gray to pale blue, while her mind churned through impossible calculations. Thomas McCarran's words echoed repeatedly. 3 weeks separated. Don't know if he's alive. Josiah Crawford called an emergency meeting shortly after breakfast. The wagon train was scheduled to depart Fort Bridger in 2 days, heading northwest toward Fort Hall in Idaho Territory. The window for crossing the Blue Mountains before heavy snow arrived was narrowing. Any significant delay risked disaster. Crawford addressed the assembled emigrants with his characteristic bluntness. Thomas McCarran brought valuable information about water sources and safe campsites along the route. His brother, Daniel, sacrificed himself to ensure that information reached us. We owe it to him to use it wisely and keep moving. I know some of you have grown close to Daniel, but we cannot risk 43 families on the possibility of one man's survival. Martha stood before she consciously decided to speak. I'm going back to look for him. The statement produced immediate uproar. Samuel Whitmore grabbed his daughter's arm, pulling her aside while others began arguing about the madness of such a proposal. Eleanor Whitmore looked horrified, as if Martha had just announced her intention to sprout wings and fly. Absolutely not, Samuel said firmly, once they were away from the crowd. It's suicide. You don't know the territory, you can't track, you have no experience with, then I'll learn, Martha interrupted. Papa, I'm going. With your blessing, or without it, but I'm going. Her father's expression cycled through anger, fear, and finally a kind of resigned understanding. He had seen that determination in his daughter's eyes only once before, years ago, when she had insisted on staying at her dying sister's bedside despite the risk of contagion. Martha possessed her mother's stubbornness and her father's practical courage, a dangerous combination. You'll die out there, he said quietly. You understand that? The land alone will kill you, never mind hostile warriors or wild animals. Then I'll die trying, Martha replied. I can't continue to Oregon knowing I abandoned him. Can't build a life on that foundation. Thomas McCarran approached them cautiously. Up close, Martha could see that he was younger than she'd initially thought, barely 18. with his brother's same dark hair but lacking Daniel's weathered confidence. His wounded arm hung uselessly at his side, the bandage showing fresh blood seepage. "Miss Whitmore," he began hesitantly. "I understand your feelings, but Crawford's right. The wilderness doesn't care about love or loyalty. Daniel knew the risks. He'd want you to continue on to be safe." "Would he?" Martha challenged. "'Cause the Daniel I know wouldn't abandon someone he cared about just because it was dangerous or inconvenient. Tell me, Thomas, if your situations were reversed, would Daniel leave you behind?" The young man's face contorted with emotion. "No," he admitted after a long pause. "He'd come looking, then never stop looking, then neither will I." Over the next 24 hours, a plan emerged through a series of difficult conversations. Thomas agreed to guide Martha back toward the Powder River region, despite his injury and Crawford's strong objections. They would take 2 horses, minimal supplies, and travel fast. If they found no trace of Daniel within 10 days, they would turn back toward the Oregon Trail and attempt to catch up with another wagon train or find shelter at one of the military forts for the winter. Samuel Whitmore, recognizing that he could not change his daughter's mind, focused on practical preparations. He gave Martha his best rifle, a Kentucky long rifle that had survived the war. He taught her loading and firing procedures, making her practice until her shoulder ached from the recoil. Eleanor Whitmore refused to speak to her daughter, her silence radiating disapproval and fear in equal measure. The night before their departure, Martha sat with her mother in the wagon. Eleanor was mending clothes by lamplight, her needle moving with mechanical precision. "You think I'm foolish?" Martha said into the silence. Her mother continued sewing for several moments before responding. "I think you're young. Young people confuse passion with love and love with necessity. In 6 months, you'll have forgotten Daniel McCarran's name. But you'll be alive to forget it, which is what matters." "I won't forget," Martha said. "And this isn't just about Daniel. It's about who I want to be, the kind of person I can live with being." Eleanor finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You're going to break your father's heart. Break mine too, probably. Better broken and true than whole and false," Martha replied, though the words felt inadequate for the enormity of what she was choosing. Her mother set down her sewing and reached for Martha's hand, holding it tightly. "Then go. Find him or don't. But come back to us. Promise me you'll come back. I promise." The next morning, as dawn painted the fort's wooden walls in shades of rose and amber, Martha and Thomas prepared to depart. A small crowd gathered to witness what many believed would be the last time they'd see Samuel Whitmore's stubborn daughter alive. Josiah Crawford approached with a leather saddlebag containing jerked meat, hardtack, and ammunition. "You're making a mistake," he said, though his tone carried more resignation than anger. "But I respect the courage it takes to make it. Daniel McCarran is lucky to have inspired such loyalty." He paused, then added, "If you find him alive, tell him he's the best scout I've ever worked with. Tell him he's got employment with any wagon train I lead whenever he wants it." Martha mounted her horse's sturdy bay mare her father had purchased specifically for this. Journey Ann adjusted the rifle strapped across her back. She looked back once at the wagon that had been her home for 3 months, at her father standing straight and stoic, her mother crying openly now, all pretense of stoicism abandoned. "I'll see you in Oregon," Martha called out, her voice carrying across the morning air. "That's a promise." Then she and Thomas turned their horses northeast, away from the wagon train, away from safety and civilization, toward a wilderness that had already claimed countless lives and would likely claim more. Behind them, according to expedition journals kept by various emigrants and later archived at the Oregon Historical Society, the Whitmore family and 42 others continued their journey westward, carrying Martha's decision like a wound that would take years to heal. 15th of September, 1866, found Martha and Thomas McCarran, 4 days into their search, camped in a shallow ravine near the Powder River's southern tributaries. The landscape had transformed dramatically since leaving Fort Bridger from high desert scrubland to increasingly rugged terrain marked by rocky outcrops, dense pine forests, and swift-running streams that originated in distant mountains. The beauty was undeniable, but carried an underlying menace, a constant reminder that nature had no interest in human survival. Martha had learned quickly that frontier travel bore little resemblance to the protected monotony of wagon train life. Every decision carried weight, which direction to ride, where to camp, whether to light a fire that might attract attention, how to ration supplies that would need to last an uncertain duration. Thomas, despite his youth and injury-proved, incapable teacher. He had absorbed his older brother's wilderness knowledge through years of accompanying him on hunting expeditions. "Daniel taught me to read the land," Thomas explained one evening as they shared a cold dinner of jerked venison and hardtack. He refused to build a fire after spotting smoke signals in the distant hills the previous day. Every broken branch, every disturbed patch of grass, every set of tracks tells a story. You just have to learn the language. Martha was learning, though the education came hard. Her hands, once soft from genteel southern upbringing, now bore blisters and calluses from handling reins and rifle. Her body ached constantly from long hours in the saddle. But alongside the physical discomfort came an unexpected sense of liberation. For perhaps the first time in her life, she was making decisions that directly determined her survival, unmediated by father or mother or social expectation. They followed Thomas's memory of the route he and Daniel had taken, backtracking toward the area where the brothers had encountered the Lakota war party. The landmarks were subtle: a lightning-struck pine, a distinctive rock formation, a bend in the river where sandbars created natural crossing points. Thomas moved with increasing confidence as familiar territory revealed itself. On the fifth day, they found the first concrete evidence of the encounter. A small clearing showed signs of recent conflict. Disturbed earth, broken arrows, dark stains on rocks that could only be dried blood. Thomas dismounted carefully, examining the scene with practiced attention. "This is where it happened," he said quietly. "We were watering the horses right there, by that outcrop. They came from the tree line, maybe a dozen warriors. We fired a few shots, mounted up fast. Daniel went west, I went south. The idea was to split their attention, give both of us better chances." Martha felt her stomach tighten. The blood on the rocks suddenly became horrifically real, transforming from abstract evidence into the tangible reminder that Daniel might have died violently in this very spot. "Which direction did they follow?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Most went after Daniel," Thomas admitted, the guilt evident in his expression. "He was the better target holder, more experienced. They probably figured he was the leader." They spent the rest of the day searching the surrounding area, moving in gradually widening circles from the conflict site. Martha had expected to find something definitive: a body, a grave marker, some clear indication of Daniel's fate. Instead, they found only fragmentary clues: a brass button from a Union cavalry jacket caught in brush, hoofprints that might or might not be relevant, a torn piece of cloth that Thomas tentatively identified as coming from Daniel's shirt. As evening approached, Thomas suggested they make camp in a protected hollow surrounded by large boulders. The location offered concealment and a defensible position should they need it. Martha helped gather wood for a small, smokeless fire built against a rock face to dissipate the heat signature. She was learning the constant calculation of risk that defined frontier existence. Every comfort weighed against potential danger, every decision a gamble with survival as the stakes. That night, unable to sleep, Martha retrieved the wooden box containing her unsent letters. By firelight, she added another entry, her handwriting shakier than usual from cold and exhaustion. "September 15th, 1866. We found where you fought them, Daniel. Found your blood on the stones. Thomas says you were always the braver one, always the protector. I think he's wrong. I think you were simply the one who loved more deeply, who couldn't abandon those who depended on you. I understand that now. I understand that courage and love are sometimes the same thing." The following morning brought unexpected hope. Thomas found tracks leading west from the conflict sit a single horse, moving at irregular speeds, the gait suggesting injury to either horse or rider. The tracks were 3 weeks old, partially obscured by weather and wildlife, but still readable to someone who knew what to look for. "Could be Daniel," Thomas said, his voice cautious with restrained optimism. "Could also be one of the Lakota warriors, or someone entirely unrelated. But the timing's right and the direction makes sense if he was trying to reach Fort Reno." Fort Reno was a military outpost approximately 70 miles north, part of the series of installations designed to protect travelers on the Bozeman Trail. If Daniel had been wounded but escaped, attempting to reach the fort would have been his logical strategy. They followed the tracks for 3 more days, pushing their horses as hard as they dared. The trail led through increasingly difficult terrain, steep ravines, dense forests where the tracks disappeared beneath pine needles and required careful searching to relocate, river crossings where they had to guess which direction the rider had continued. On the evening of September 18th, as they crested a ridge overlooking a small valley, Thomas grabbed Martha's arm and pointed toward a thin column of smoke rising from a copse of aspen trees near a creek. "Could be anyone," he whispered. "Could be hostile. But we need to investigate." They approached cautiously, leaving their horses tethered a quarter-mile back and continuing on foot.
Ass!
Martha carried the rifle at ready position, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it might give away their position. As they drew closer, they could see a crude shelter constructed from branches and pine boughs, the smoke coming from a carefully contained fire. Thomas signaled for Martha to stay back while he moved forward. He disappeared into the trees, and for several agonizing minutes, she heard nothing. Then his voice rang out, breaking with emotion. "Martha, Martha, come quickly." She ran without thinking, crashing through underbrush and low branches. The shelter came into view, and there, lying on a bed of pine needles and wrapped in a wool blanket that had seen better days, was Daniel McCarran. He was alive, but barely recognizable, gaunt, bearded, his left leg wrapped in crude bandages stained with old blood. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. Thomas knelt beside his brother, checking his pulse. "He's burning with fever," he said, his medical knowledge limited but sufficient to recognize crisis. "The leg wound is infected. He's been alone out here for weeks, surviving on God knows what." Martha knelt on Daniel's other side, taking his hand. It was dry and hot, the skin papery. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and he began speaking in a delirium. "Martha, I have to get back. She's waiting. Promised I'd return." 19th of September, 1866, brought no improvement in Daniel's condition. And Martha faced the harsh reality that finding him alive meant accepting responsibility for keeping him that way. The crude shelter he had constructed offered minimal protection from the elements, and his supplies had dwindled to almost nothing, a near-empty canteen, moldy hardtack, and the remains of small game he'd managed to trap before the infection made movement impossible. Thomas examined Daniel's wounded leg with grim expertise, carefully unwrapping the makeshift bandages to reveal a bullet wound in the outer thigh, badly infected and weeping pus. The projectile appeared to have passed through muscle without striking bone or major arteries, a stroke of luck that had allowed Daniel to survive this long, but the subsequent infection threatened to undo that fortune. "We need to clean it properly," Thomas said, his young face betraying the weight of decisions he was too inexperienced to be making. "Hot water, clean cloth, and probably cauterization to burn out the infection. It's going to hurt him badly, and there's no guarantee it'll work." Martha had grown up in an era when women were expected to know basic medical care, battlefield injuries, and frontier medicine had become common knowledge during and after the war. She had assisted her mother in tending to wounded soldiers who occasionally sought refuge at their Virginia farm. But this was different. This was Daniel, burning with fever, occasionally surfacing into consciousness long enough to murmur incoherent fragments about Martha, the wagon train promises he needed to keep. They spent the morning preparing. Thomas built a larger fire and set water to boil in the single pot they carried. Martha tore strips from her cleanest petticoat to create fresh bandages. They had no laudanum or whiskey to dull the pain. No proper surgical instruments beyond Thomas's hunting knife, which they sterilized in the boiling water. The procedure was barbaric by any standard. They waited until Daniel emerged from his delirium briefly, explaining what needed to happen. His eyes, when they focused on Martha, showed recognition and something that might have been gratitude or apology. "Do what you have to," he whispered, his voice raw. "Just don't let me die before I tell you something. You can tell me after." Martha replied, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "You're not dying, Daniel. I didn't track you across 200 miles of wilderness just to watch you die." Thomas cleaned the wound as thoroughly as possible, then heated the blade of his knife in the fire until it glowed red. The cauterization was brutal. Daniel's screams echoed across the valley, sending birds fleeing from nearby trees. Martha held him down, her own tears mixing with his sweat, while Thomas applied the heated metal to infected flesh. The smell of burning tissue made Martha's stomach revolt, but she forced herself to remain steady, whispering reassurances that she didn't believe herself. When it was finally over, Daniel had passed into unconscious again, mercifully released from pain. They bandaged the wound with clean cloth, then wrapped him in every blanket they possessed. All they could do now was wait, keep him warm, force water and broth down his throat whenever he surfaced, and hope that youth and constitution were sufficient to overcome infection. The next 3 days existed outside normal time, measured not in hours, but in the rise and fall of Daniel's fever. Martha barely slept, keeping constant vigil, bathing his face with cool water, talking to him during his brief periods of semi-consciousness. Thomas hunted small game and maintained the fire, giving his brother's fragile life the support of practical necessities. On the second night, Daniel's fever spiked dangerously high. He thrashed in delirium, reliving the battle with the Lakota warriors, calling out orders to retreat, screaming warnings that arrived weeks too late to save anyone. Martha held him, her arms around his shoulders, her voice steady as she brought him back from whatever battlefield haunted his dreams. "Daniel, you're safe," she repeated over and over. "The fight is over. You survived. I'm here. I came back for you, just like you came back for Thomas. We keep our promises, remember?" Sometime near dawn, his fever broke. The crisis passed so suddenly that Martha almost missed it. One moment he was burning and incoherent. The next his temperature had dropped and his breathing steadied. His eyes opened, truly focused for the first time in days. "Martha," his voice was barely audible. "You're real? Not fever dream?" "I'm real," she confirmed, laughing and crying simultaneously. "Very real, and very annoyed that you almost died before I could tell you how foolish you are." A weak smile crossed his face. "Foolish seems fair. Getting shot was definitely not my best work." Over the following days, Daniel's improvement accelerated. The infection receded, the wound began showing signs of healthy healing, and his strength gradually returned. Thomas proved himself invaluable, hunting successfully and maintaining their camp while Martha focused on nursing. They extended their stay in the valley, recognizing that moving Daniel too soon risked undoing their hard-won progress. According to frontier medical journals examined by historians decades later, survival rates from serious gunshot wounds in the 1860s ranged from 30 to 50%, depending on location of injury and quality of treatment. Infection was the primary killer, and those who survived the initial trauma frequently succumbed to secondary complications. Daniel's recovery represented both medical luck and stubborn determination. One evening, as Daniel sat propped against a tree near the fire, his leg elevated on a rolled blanket, he finally found words for what had been building between them since that first meeting by the creek months ago. "When I was out here alone before you found me," he began, speaking carefully as if each word cost him energy he couldn't afford, "I kept thinking about the waste of it, not Dajin. I made peace with that possibility when I joined the cavalry. But dying before I'd really lived, before I'd built something worth remembering, before I'd told you that I love you." Martha's breath caught. In the social world she'd been raised in, such declarations followed prescribed timelines and proper courtship rituals. But that world belonged to a different life, a different Martha. "I love you too," she replied, the simplicity of the statement containing multitudes. "I loved you when I decided to come looking. I loved you when Thomas told me you might be dead. I loved you when you screamed from pain, and I thought we might be killing you trying to save you. I love you now, damaged and healing and more real than any fantasy I ever had about what my life was supposed to be. Thomas." Sitting across the fire, cleared his throat with exaggerated awkwardness. "Should I go check on the horses? Maybe walk to the next territory?" They laughed then, all three of them, and the sound carried across the valley like a small victory against all the forces historical, natural, and human arrayed against them. By September 28th, Daniel could walk short distances with support. They began planning their return journey, debating whether to attempt catching up with the original wagon train now impossibly far ahead, winter at Fort Reno, or risk the mountain passes before heavy snow arrived. "We head for Oregon," Daniel decided. Not. This season we've lost too much time. But we find shelter, survive the winter, and continue in spring. If that's what you both still want, what I want," Martha said firmly, is to never be separated from you again. Everything else is just details. 7th of October, 1866, brought the first serious snowfall to the high plains, confirming that their window for crossing the mountains had firmly closed. Martha, Daniel, and Thomas arrived at Fort Reno on a gray afternoon when ice crystals hung suspended in the air like diamond dust, their horses' breath creating clouds of vapor that dissipated slowly in the still, cold atmosphere. Fort Reno was one of 3 military installations established along the Bozeman Trail to protect immigrants and miners traveling to the Montana goldfields. The post consisted of log buildings arranged in a rough square, surrounded by a wooden palisade wall that offered minimal security against determined attack. Approximately 200 soldiers were garrisoned there under the command of Captain James Powell, a Civil War veteran whose weathered face reflected years of frontier hardship. The post was crowded with civilians who, like Martha's party, had miscalculated their timing or encountered unexpected delays. Roughly 40 people families, miners, traders, and various frontier wanderers had taken refuge there for the winter. Living conditions were cramped and primitive, but the alternative was freezing to death in the wilderness or risking mountain passes that regularly claimed lives, even under ideal conditions. Captain Powell listened to their story with professional detachment, occasionally interrupting with clarifying questions. When Thomas finished explaining their journey, Powell leaned back in his chair and studied the 3 young people before him. "You're either the bravest or most foolish trio I've encountered," he said finally. "Probably both. Miss Whitmore, you realize you've accomplished something most seasoned scouts wouldn't attempt? Tracking a wounded man across hostile territory with minimal experience and surviving to tell about it?" Martha met his gaze steadily. "I wasn't interested in being remarkable, Captain. I was interested in finding someone important to me." Powell nodded slowly. "Well, you're stuck here until April at earliest. Can provide basic shelter and supplies, though you'll need to contribute to the fort's operations, hunting, cooking, repairs, whatever your skills allow. No freeloaders make it through winter in this country." They settled into a routine that blended military discipline with frontier improvisation. Daniel, still recovering from his wound, took on maintenance work he could perform without extensive walking repairing equipment, cleaning weapons, teaching other civilians basic wilderness skills. Thomas proved himself an excellent hunter, regularly bringing in deer and elk that supplemented the fort's dwindling provisions. Martha worked in the communal kitchen and, drawing on her experience caring for Daniel, helped the fort's overwhelmed medical officer treat various ailments and injuries. The forced proximity of winter quarters compressed years of normal courtship into months. Martha and Daniel spent hours together, talking in ways that would have been impossible under the supervised social conditions of their former lives. They discussed everything: their childhoods, the war's impact on their families, their dreams for the future, their fears about whether they could actually build something lasting in the harsh Western territories. "I don't have much to offer you," Daniel said one December evening as they sat near the communal fire. Most of the fort's residents had retired to their cramped quarters, but Martha and Daniel often lingered, treasuring the relative privacy. "No land deed, no family wealth. My father died at Gettysburg, and my mother passed 2 years later from grief and pneumonia. Thomas and I have each other, and we have skills, but in terms of traditional security—" "I don't want traditional security," Martha interrupted. "I've seen what that looks like. It's my parents clinging to memories of Virginia while their actual lives collapse around them. It's rules and expectations that protect property instead of people. If I wanted traditional security, I would have stayed with the wagon train and married whoever my mother deemed acceptable. What do you want then?" Daniel asked, his tone serious. Martha considered the question carefully. Through the fort's walls, she could hear wind howling across the plains, carrying snow and cold and the vast indifference of nature. But inside, near the fire, with Daniel beside her, she felt more certain about her path than she had since leaving Virginia. "I want a partnership," she said finally. "Someone who sees me as an equal, not a decorative possession or a domestic servant. I want to build something together, a homestead, a life, maybe eventually a family. I want to wake up every morning knowing that I chose this, that I'm not just accepting whatever fate or society hands me." Daniel took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "That sounds like something worth surviving winter for." They were married on Christmas Day, 1866, in a ceremony performed by Captain Powell, who held legal authority to conduct marriages within his jurisdiction. The fort's chaplain had died of influenza 2 weeks earlier, so Powell officiated using a battered army manual and improvised vows that were more practical than poetic. "Do you, Daniel Joseph McCarran, promise to honor this woman, provide for her to the best of your ability, and treat her as a partner in all the considerable hardships life will inevitably throw at you?" "I do," Daniel replied, his voice steady. "And do you, Martha Elizabeth Whitmore, promise the same to this man, recognizing that frontier life offers no guarantees, and that you're entering this union with full awareness of its challenges?" "I do," Martha answered. "Then by the authority vested in me by the United States Army and common sense, I declare you married. Let God help you both." The ceremony was witnessed by Thomas, 3 other civilians, and 2 soldiers who happened to be on duty nearby. There was no white dress, no church bells, no reception with cake and champagne. But as Daniel kissed his wife for the first time, Martha felt a sense of rightness that she suspected few traditional weddings ever achieved. Winter deepened, bringing temperatures that dropped far below zero and snowdrifts that buried the fort's lower walls. The isolation was profound. Weeks would pass without any contact with the outside world, the fort existing as a tiny island of human habitation in a frozen wilderness. 3 people died during those months, 1 from pneumonia, 1 from an accident involving a wagon wheel, 1 from infection following a minor cut that should have been survivable. Death's proximity forced everyone to confront fundamental questions about what made life worth living despite its fragility. Martha recorded her thoughts in a journal she had begun keeping, filling pages with observations about frontier life, sketches of the landscape, and reflections on her transformation from southern plantation daughter to frontier wife. February 12, 1867, she wrote, "1 year ago today, I could not have imagined this life. Was still in Virginia, still pretending the world hadn't fundamentally changed, still believing that if we simply maintained proper appearances, everything would eventually return to normal. That Martha is dead. She died somewhere on the Oregon Trail, maybe at Fort Laramie, maybe earlier. Martha knows how to shoot a rifle, treat infected wounds, survive on jerked meat and hardtack. This Martha is married to a man with no property or prospects, and feels richer than any plantation wife ever could. I think I prefer this version, even with all the hardship." Daniel recovered fully from his wound, though he would always walk with a slight limp, rather than viewing it as a disability. He incorporated it into his understanding of himself, physical proof that he had survived something that should have killed him. He began teaching Martha advanced wilderness skills, recognizing that frontier wives needed every advantage they could acquire. By March, as the snow began melting and the first green shoots appeared in protected areas, they finalized plans for continuing to Oregon. Captain Powell provided them with letters of introduction to Fort Hall and other installations along their route, along with maps showing recommended paths through the remaining mountain passes. "You'll want to wait until May," he advised. "The passes are still dangerous, but by then you should have clear enough conditions to make it through." And Miss Whitmore, Mrs. McCarran, I should say you've impressed me considerably. This country needs more women like you, ones who don't break under pressure." Martha smiled. "I think you'll find there are more of us than you might expect, Captain. Just haven't all had the opportunity to prove it yet." 4th of May, 1867, marked their departure from Fort Reno, riding northwest toward the Blue Mountains and the final stretch of their truncated Oregon Trail journey. Spring had transformed the landscape dramatically where winter had offered only monochromatic expanses of white and gray. Now, wildflowers carpeted the foothills in purple, yellow, and red. Creeks ran high with snowmelt, and migrating birds filled the air with songs that seemed almost excessive after months of winter silence. They traveled with 2 other parties who had also wintered at Fort Renoa, a family of Swedish immigrants named the Lindgrens, consisting of parents and 3 children, and a pair of prospectors heading to the Idaho goldfields. The group was small enough to move relatively quickly, but large enough to provide mutual protection against the various dangers that still haunted the frontier. Martha rode beside Daniel, both of them leading pack horses loaded with supplies purchased using money Daniel had earned through winter work at the fort. Thomas ranged ahead, continuing his education as a scout under his brother's tutelage. The dynamic between the three of them had evolved into something resembling a functional family unit. Martha, the pragmatic planner, Daniel, the experienced guide, Thomas, the eager apprentice. The journey through Wyoming and Idaho territories took nearly 2 months. Following established trails when possible, and improvising routes when necessary, they encountered Shoshone traders near Fort Hall, peaceful meetings that involved bartering for fresh horses and information about conditions ahead. The Shoshone provided warnings about early-season flooding in some river valleys, allowing the group to adjust their route and avoid potentially fatal crossings. Daniel's reputation as a skilled scout had spread through the loose network of military posts and trading stations that dotted the frontier. At Fort Hall, the commanding officer offered him permanent employment, guiding military expeditions. Martha watched her husband decline politely but firmly. "I appreciate the offer, Major, but we have other plans. We're claiming homestead land in the Willamette Valley. Time to put down roots instead of just wandering." That evening, camped along the Snake River with the sound of rushing water providing constant background music, Martha reflected on how far they had traveled in every sense, not just the physical miles, but the transformation of identity and purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked Daniel as they sat together watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and pink. Turning down steady military pay for the uncertainty of homesteading, Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering his answer with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I spent years taking orders, first in the war, then scouting for wagon trains and army expeditions. Good work, necessary work, but always serving someone else's vision. What we're building now, that's ours. It might fail, probably will fail in some ways, but the failures will be ours too. It's that matters to me." They crossed into Oregon territory in early July, descending from high desert plateau into the gradual green slopes that characterized the territory's western regions. The Willamette Valley, when they finally reached it, seemed almost impossibly fertile after months of harsh frontier landscape, deep soil, abundant water. Forests thick with Douglas fir and western red cedar, a climate that promised long growing seasons and manageable winters. Under the Homestead Act, they could claim 160 acres of public land, required to improve it with dwelling and cultivation over 5 years before receiving full title. Daniel selected a site along a tributary creek, with good timber access, level ground for farming, and natural protection from a hillside that would block prevailing winter winds. "This is it," he said, surveying the land with an expression Martha had learned to recognize as his version of joy, quiet, contained, but genuine. "We can build here." The first months of homesteading tested them in ways different from, but no less demanding than their earlier trials. They constructed a one-room log cabin, using timber Daniel and Thomas cut from their property. Learning through trial and error how to notch logs properly, seal gaps with moss and mud, and create a roof that would keep out Oregon's famous rain.
Ow.
Martha planted a vegetable garden, drawing on knowledge from her Virginia childhood, but adapting to different climate conditions and growing seasons. Neighbors were scattered, but present other homesteaders. People who had arrived via various routes and circumstances, but shared the common goal of establishing permanent settlement. They helped each other during critical periods, barn raisings, harvests, emergencies. A sense of community emerged organically, based not on shared history but on mutual need and recognition that survival required cooperation. By autumn, they had achieved a rough but functional establishment. The cabin stood weatherproof, the garden had produced enough vegetables to preserve for winter, and Daniel had contracted with a local sawmill to scout timber claims, providing necessary income while they waited for their own farm to become productive. Martha corresponded regularly with her parents, who had successfully reached the Willamette Valley with their original wagon train and settled roughly 50 miles south. The letters were polite but restrained, the relationship complicated by her parents' inability to fully accept her choices. Eleanor Whitmore had written, "Your father and I are pleased to learn you have survived and established yourself, though we cannot pretend to understand the path you chose. You could have married Mr. Patterson's son, who owns a successful mercantile in Oregon City, but instead you allied yourself with a penniless scout. We pray this decision does not lead to the regret we fear it will." Martha responded carefully, attempting to bridge the gap between their worldviews. "Dear mother and father, I understand your concerns reflect love rather than criticism, but I would ask you to judge my marriage by its actual qualities rather than its failure to meet social expectations, belong to a world that no longer exists. Daniel is a good man, hardworking, and honorable. We have built something real here, something that belongs to us. I am happier than I have ever been, and I hope you can eventually find peace with my choices. On December 25th, 1867, Martha and Daniel celebrated their first wedding anniversary in their completed cabin, with Thomas and several neighbors joining for a modest feast of roasted venison, preserved vegetables, and berry pie made from wild blackberries Martha had gathered. As snow fell gently outside, turning their rough homestead into something that resembled the Christmas scenes from Martha's childhood storybooks, she felt the pieces of her life settling into a pattern she could recognize as home. "A year ago, we were at Fort Reno," Daniel observed, surrounded by soldiers and strangers, with no idea if we'd survive to see this day. "And now we're here," Martha completed the thought. "In a cabin we built, on land we're claiming, with people we've chosen as family. The newspapers back east would probably consider us failures, no wealth, no status, living in rough conditions on the edge of civilization.
Oh,
But I don't think I've ever felt more successful." Thomas raised his cup of cider and toast. To surviving, to choosing, to being too stubborn to accept what everyone said was impossible, they drank to that sentiment. And as conversation shifted to plans for spring planting and future expansion, Martha excused herself briefly and stepped outside into the softly falling snow. The night was clear, despite the precipitation, stars visible between clouds, the familiar constellations she had learned to navigate by during their long journey. She thought about the Martha who had climbed into a wagon in Missouri nearly 18 months earlier, uncertain and afraid, but determined to find something better than what she was leaving behind. That Martha had imagined Oregon as a destination, a place where life would finally settle into the stability she'd been seeking. But this Martha, the one who had tracked a wounded man across hostile territory, who had married in a frontier fort with no white dress or family present, who had built a cabin and planted a garden and learned to shoot a rifle with deadly accuracy, understood that Oregon was not a destination. It was simply another chapter in a story that would continue evolving as long as she had the courage to keep choosing her own path. Daniel emerged from the cabin, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Cold out here. Beautiful, though," Martha replied, leaning into his warmth. "Worth the cold?" They stood together in the quiet snowfall, two people who had survived more than most marriages endure in a lifetime, building something fragile and precious in a land that offered no guarantees but infinite possibility. 15th of March, 1868 brought unseasonably warm weather that accelerated the spring thaw and allowed Daniel and Martha to begin their second year of homesteading earlier than anticipated. The winter had been relatively mild by Oregon standards, though they had experienced weeks of continuous rain that turned their clearing into a muddy expanse and tested the cabin's roof, revealing several leaks that required repair. Thomas had left in January, heading to California with a group of prospectors who had promised him partnership in a mining claim. His departure left an emptiness in the household, though both Martha and Daniel understood that the young man needed to find his own path. Before leaving, Thomas had helped expand the cabin, adding a second room that would eventually serve as a bedroom once children arrived, a possibility that Martha had begun to suspect might materialize sooner than planned. The homestead was beginning to show signs of permanence. What had been raw frontier land was gradually transforming into something recognizable as a farm. Daniel had cleared 3 acres for cultivation, backbreaking work that involved removing stumps, breaking soil, and manually picking stones. Martha expanded her garden significantly, adding medicinal herbs she had learned to identify and cultivate. They acquired 2 milk cows, purchased from a neighbor in exchange for Daniel's scouting services, and constructed a small barn to house them along with their horses. The broader Willamette Valley was experiencing similar transformation. The population had grown substantially according to records maintained by the Oregon Territorial Government. Nearly 12,000 settlers had arrived during 1867 alone, drawn by reports of fertile land and the Transcontinental Railroad's gradual westward progress. Towns were emerging from scattered settlements, complete with general stores, churches, schools, and other markers of established civilization. Martha's relationship with her parents improved slowly, as proximity and time softened their initial disapproval. Samuel and Eleanor Whitmore visited the homestead in April, their first trip to see what their daughter had built. Eleanor arrived prepared to find squalor and disappointment, but even she had to acknowledge the cabin's solid construction, the productive garden, the evidence of careful planning and hard work. "It's rustic," she admitted, which from Eleanor Whitmore constituted significant praise. "You've clearly been industrious." Samuel was more openly impressed. He walked the property with Daniel, discussing crop rotation, irrigation possibilities, and timber value. At one point, standing on the hillside overlooking the cleared acres, he spoke with uncharacteristic directness. "I judged you harshly initially, Daniel. I saw a penniless scout and worried my daughter was throwing her life away on romantic fantasy. I was wrong. You've built something solid here, something that can grow. More importantly, you've made Martha happy in ways I don't think she ever was in Virginia, even before the war destroyed everything." Daniel accepted the apology gracefully. "I understand your concerns, sir. In your position, I'd have felt the same. But Martha and I understand each other. We're building this together as partners. That matters more than any inheritance or social position I could have brought to the marriage." By summer, the homestead was producing surplus crops that they could trade at the general store in the nearest town, a settlement called Cascade Falls located roughly 12 miles east. The town consisted of approximately 30 buildings clustered around a crossroads, serving the surrounding homesteaders with essential supplies and services. Martha became a regular visitor, trading her vegetables, eggs, and preserves for flour, fabric, tools, and other necessities they couldn't produce themselves. It was during one of these trips that she learned she was pregnant. The town had recently acquired a doctor, a young man from Boston named Edward Fletcher, who had moved west for reasons he didn't discuss. Dr. Fletcher confirmed what Martha had already suspected, estimating that the baby would arrive in late December or early January. Daniel's reaction was complex joy, mixed with anxiety about the added responsibility and potential dangers of childbirth in frontier conditions. Maternal mortality remained high throughout the country, particularly in rural areas with limited medical resources. Martha shared his concerns but refused to let fear dominate their response. "Women have been having babies in difficult circumstances since humanity began," she reminded him. "I'm healthy, we have access to a doctor if necessary, and I have you. It's more than many frontier wives can claim." They spent the autumn constructing a cradle from wood Daniel carved during evening hours, accumulating cloth for diapers and infant clothes, laying in extra supplies in case winter storms prevented travel to town. Neighboring women offered advice, shared hand-me-down baby items, promised assistance during labor and the immediate postnatal period. Martha continued working through her pregnancy, only moderately slowing her pace as her body changed. She found the experience both fascinating and occasionally frustrating the way her center of gravity shifted, making familiar tasks suddenly awkward, the fatigue that would arrive unexpectedly, requiring naps she had never needed before. But she also experienced moments of profound connection to something larger than herself. The awareness that she was participating in the fundamental human drama of continuation and renewal. On December 28, 1868, after a labor that lasted 15 hours, Martha gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth McCarran. The birth occurred during a winter storm that prevented Dr. Fletcher from reaching the homestead. So Martha was attended by two neighbor women who had experience with frontier childbirth, Mrs. Lindgren, the Swedish immigrant whose family had traveled with them from Fort Reno, and a Cherokee woman named Catherine who had married a white homesteader and possessed extensive knowledge of traditional medicine and birthing practices. Daniel waited outside the cabin during labor, pacing in falling snow and listening to his wife's screams with the helpless anxiety that has characterized expectant fathers throughout history. When Catherine finally emerged to tell him he had a daughter, both mother and baby healthy, he felt something inside him release a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged he'd been carrying since learning of the pregnancy. Holding Sarah for the first time, studying her tiny face and impossibly small fingers, Daniel experienced an emotion he struggled to articulate. It was more intense than his love for Martha, more visceral than his grief for his parents, more powerful than any feeling he'd experienced during the war or the dangerous years that followed. This small, helpless creature represented everything they had built and risked and survived to create a future that extended beyond their own lives, a legacy that would continue after they were gone. Martha, exhausted but alert, watched her husband with their daughter, and felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. "Yeah, we did it," she whispered. "We actually built this life." The months following Sarah's birth brought new challenges and adjustments. Infant care on a frontier homestead was demanding the constant feeding and washing and monitoring, all while maintaining the work necessary for the farm's survival. Martha learned to accomplish tasks while wearing Sarah in a sling Catherine had taught her to construct, keeping the baby close while planting, weeding, preserving food, and performing the 100 other duties that sustained their household. Daniel expanded his scouting work, contracting with wagon trains, timber companies, and occasionally law enforcement agencies tracking criminals in the extensive wilderness. The income supplemented their farm production, allowing them to purchase equipment and livestock that accelerated their establishment. By spring of 1869, they owned 4 cows, a small flock of chickens, 2 pigs, and enough acreage under cultivation to consider hiring occasional help during peak seasons. Their lives had achieved a rhythm that felt sustainable but not desperate, requiring constant work but offering clear rewards for that effort. They were no longer pioneering in the most extreme sense. Having crossed the threshold from initial survival to something approaching stability, yet Martha remained aware of how fragile their success was. Disease could strike at any moment. Sarah's health required constant vigilance. Crop failures could wipe out a season's income. Accidents disabled or killed even careful farmers. The broader political situation remained unsettled, with ongoing conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes whose lands were being systematically appropriated. The Transcontinental Railroad's completion in May 1869 symbolized the rapid transformation occurring throughout the West, connections forming that would eventually erase the frontier conditions that had defined their early years. One evening in September, sitting on their cabin's porch while Sarah played nearby with a wooden horse Daniel had carved, Martha and Daniel discussed their future with unusual philosophical depth. "Do you think we'll tell her the real story?" Martha asked, watching their daughter. "When she's old enough to understand, do we tell her everything? The war, the wagon train, finding you half dead in the wilderness, the whole improbable series of events that led to her existence?" Daniel considered the question seriously. "I think we tell her that life offers choices, and that the choices we make define us more than the circumstances we're born into. We tell her that her mother was brave enough to violate every social expectation when it mattered. We tell her that love is not just an emotion, but a series of actions and decisions sustained over time." "That sounds like something worth passing on," Martha agreed, then smiled. "Though I suspect she'll simplify it into whatever version of our story makes sense to her generation. That's what children do, take their parents' complicated lives and reduce them to simple lessons." Sarah looked up then, responding to her parents' attention, her face breaking into a grin that seemed to contain all the joy and possibility they had fought so hard to secure. In that moment, watching their daughter play in the dooryard of a cabin they had built on land they were earning through sustained effort, Martha understood that they had succeeded in creating exactly what they had hoped for, not perfection. Not freedom from hardship, but a life chosen rather than inherited, built through partnership rather than imposed by tradition. 21st of June, 1870 marked exactly 4 years since Martha Elizabeth Whitmore had first seen the endless prairie from her family's wagon, beginning the journey that would ultimately bring her to this moment, standing at the window of their expanded cabin, watching Daniel teach 8-year-old Sarah how to properly saddle a horse while their younger son, 3-year-old James Samuel McCarran, played nearby with a wooden wagon Thomas had sent from California as a Christmas gift. The homestead had transformed dramatically during those 4 years. The initial 160 acres had been expanded through purchase of an adjacent claim from a family returning east after finding frontier life unbearable. They now worked 320 acres, with substantial portions under cultivation, managed pastures for their growing livestock herd, and significant timber holdings that provided both income and material for continuous expansion. The original cabin had been enlarged twice and now featured 4 rooms, glass windows purchased from Portland, and a brick chimney that replaced their initial stone construction. The Willamette Valley itself had evolved rapidly. Cascade Falls had grown from a crossroads with 30 buildings to an incorporated town approaching 300 residents, complete with a proper school where Sarah attended classes, 2 churches that competed politely for congregants, a bank, a newspaper called the Cascade Weekly Register, and a railroad depot connecting them to Portland and the wider world. The frontier was receding, pushed ever westward by the relentless advance of settlement and infrastructure. Martha had become a respected figure in the community, known for her medical knowledge, her fair trading practices at the general store, and her unconventional history that lent her a kind of romantic reputation. The story of how she had tracked a wounded scout across hostile territory had been embellished considerably in local retellings, transforming her from practical young woman making desperate choices into a frontier legend who single-handedly defeated Lakota warriors and performed miraculous healing. She tolerated the exaggerations, while occasionally correcting the most absurd inventions. Daniel's scouting work had evolved into a surveying business. Settlement intensified, precise property boundaries became increasingly important, and his wilderness knowledge translated effectively into mapping skills. He employed 2 assistants and regularly contracted with the territorial government for official surveys. The work was less dangerous than his earlier career, but equally essential to the region's development. That evening, after the children had been put to bed and the day's final chores completed, Martha and Daniel sat on their porch watching sunset paint the Cascade Mountains in shades of pink and gold. They held hands without conscious thought, a gesture so habitual it felt like extension of their individual bodies rather than connection between separate people. "Sometimes I try to imagine the alternative," Martha said quietly. "If I had stayed with the wagon train. If I had never gone looking for you. If we had never met at all." "And what do you imagine?" Daniel asked. "Nothing good," she admitted. "I see myself married to someone acceptable, living a life that looks successful from outside but feels hollow from within. Going through motions, raising children I don't really know because I'm too busy performing the role of proper wife. Growing old, having never really chosen anything important." Daniel squeezed her hand. "I don't imagine any alternative. If you hadn't come looking, I'd be dead in that valley. Everything since then, Sarah, James, this homestead, this life, it all exists because you made an impossible choice and refused to accept the reasonable response everyone expected." According to the Cascade Weekly Register's special edition published in June 1870, surveying the previous decade's development, the Oregon Territory's population had grown from approximately 52,000 in 1862, over 90,000 by 1870. The article quoted extensively from local pioneers, including a passage from Martha McCarran. "People often ask if I regret the hardships we endured establishing our homestead. The question misunderstands what those hardships represented. They weren't obstacles preventing us from reaching happiness. They were the process of creating it. Every tree we felled, every acre we cleared, every challenge we overcome together made us more ourselves, more capable, more certain that we were building something real. I wouldn't trade those difficult years for any amount of inherited comfort." Summer progressed, bringing the intensive labor of harvest. Sarah was old enough now to help significantly, taking pride in adult responsibilities. James attempted to assist, but mostly got underfoot in ways that were more endearing than useful. They hired 3 seasonal workers to help with wheat harvest. Young men recently arrived from the East who were learning frontier skills while earning money to establish their own claims. In September, Thomas returned from California for his first visit in nearly 3 years. He had done well in the mining camps, not through spectacular gold strikes, but through providing essential services equipment repair, surveying, and eventually running a supply operation. He arrived wearing clothes that suggested prosperity and carrying gifts for his niece and nephew that delighted them both. "You've built something impressive here," Thomas observed, surveying the expanded property. "Far beyond what I imagined when we were freezing at Fort Reno, wondering if we'd survive the winter." "We all have," Daniel replied. "Different paths, but similar success. I'm proud of you, Thomas. Building a business in those camps that requires different skills but equal determination." The brothers stood together. 2 men who had survived war, wilderness, and the chaotic transformation of the Western Territories. Their parents had died years ago. Their childhood home in Pennsylvania belonged to a different lifetime, but they had created something new in this place, family defined by choice and sustained effort rather than merely inherited. Martha's parents died within months of each other in 1870. One Samuel from a farming accident, Eleanor from pneumonia complicated by grief. Martha mourned them genuinely while recognizing that their relationship had never fully recovered from her decision to leave the wagon train. They had loved her in their way, but always with the disappointed recognition that she had not become the daughter they had imagined raising. At her mother's funeral, Martha encountered several women from established Oregon City families. Women who embodied the social aspirations Eleanor had hoped Martha would pursue. Their polite condolences carried undertones of satisfied superiority they had made respectable marriages, produced children in civilized circumstances, maintained proper social positions. Martha represented the road not taken, the frontier choice rather than the civilized compromise. Standing in the cemetery afterward, watching workers fill her mother's grave, Martha felt something release a final separation from the expectations that had followed her from Virginia. She had mourned her parents before they died. Mourned the relationship they could never have, because their worldviews remained fundamentally incompatible. Now she could simply remember the good parts, her father's quiet competence, her mother's determination, the love they had shown in ways they knew how, even when it wasn't the love Martha needed. By 1875, as Sarah approached 13 and James turned 8, the McCarran homestead represented everything the Homestead Act had promised and rarely delivered: a successful family farm, established through sustained effort, contributing to the regional economy and community stability. They had survived the 5-year improvement requirement and received full title to their land. They owned the earth beneath their feet in ways that felt both legally binding and spiritually significant. Daniel was 43 now, his body showing the accumulated wear of frontier life, the permanent limp from his old wound, the various scars from accidents and conflicts, the weathered skin of someone who worked outdoors regardless of season. But he remained strong, capable, deeply invested in the life they had built together. Martha was 38, her auburn hair beginning to show silver threads, her hands permanently marked by work that no amount of salves could fully soften. She had given birth to 2 more children after James's daughter, who died at 6 months from measles, and another son named Thomas Daniel, who was now 5 years old. The deaths and births, the endless cycles of planting and harvest, the accumulation of seasons had transformed her into someone unrecognizable from the uncertain young woman who had climbed into a wagon in 1866. On the evening of June 21st, 1805, exactly 9 years since she had first seen the prairie, Martha and Daniel hosted a gathering to celebrate their homestead's anniversary. Neighbors came from miles around, bringing food and music and the easy familiarity of people who had helped each other through crisis enough times to form bonds deeper than mere acquaintance. As darkness fell and lanterns were lit, creating islands of golden light across their property, someone asked Martha to tell the story of how she and Daniel had met. It was a request she received regularly, and she had developed a version that satisfied people's desire for romance while maintaining truthfulness about the essential facts. "We met on the Oregon Trail in 1866, she began, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. Daniel was scouting for our wagon train. I was 19 years old and convinced I knew nothing about anything important. We talked by a creek one evening, and he made me think differently about what my life could become." She continued the story: Daniel's dangerous assignment, his disappearance, her decision to search for him, the winter at Fort Reno, their marriage, the gradual establishment of their homestead. The audience listened with the attention people give to familiar stories that nonetheless bear repeating because they contain essential truths. "The part I want you to understand," Martha concluded, "especially you young women, is that I made a choice everyone said was impossible and foolish. I violated every expectation about proper behavior and appropriate risk. And it led to this." She gestured around at the homestead, at Daniel, at their children, at the assembled community, to everything that matters most in my life. Not despite being impossible, but because I refused to accept that definition. Later, after the guests had departed and the children were asleep, Martha and Daniel stood together in their bedroom, a space that had evolved from rough frontier necessity to something approaching genuine comfort. Tomorrow they would return to the endless work of farming, animals to tend, fields to manage, equipment to repair, accounts to balance. But tonight they allowed themselves to simply exist in the life they had created. "No regrets?" Daniel asked, a question that had become ritual between them. "Not a single one," Martha replied, and meant it completely. She thought about all the versions of herself she might have become in different circumstances. The obedient daughter who married acceptably and lived conventionally. The widow who never recovered from loss. The cautious woman who accepted other people's definitions of what was possible. All those alternate Marthas existed in potential paths not taken, lives not lived. But this Martha, the one who had tracked a wounded man across hostile wilderness, who had married in a frontier fort, who had built a homestead and raised children, and become something unprecedented in her own family history, this Martha felt complete in ways she suspected few people ever achieved. The story of Martha and Daniel McCarran would eventually become one of thousands of frontier narratives. Preserved in family histories and occasionally mentioned in scholarly works about Western settlement, their names would appear in census records and property deeds, in Sarah's descendants' genealogical research. In the accumulated documentation of ordinary lives that collectively define historical periods, but the essential truth of their story transcends historical record. Speaks to the fundamental human capacity to choose transformation over security, to build new lives from the wreckage of old certainties, to find love and meaning in circumstances that seem designed to prevent both. They had been born into one world and helped create another, and in the process discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That love was not just emotion, but sustained choice renewed daily. That home was not where you came from, but what you built through shared effort and mutual commitment. As Martha drifted towards sleep that night, Daniel's breathing already deepened into peaceful rhythm beside her. She felt grateful not just for survival, but for the particular shape her life had chosen, earned, and ultimately hers in ways that birth and inheritance could never have provided. The open roads and long summers of 1866 had led here. To this room, this man, this life built from nothing but determination and love. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.